I left a 1-star review calling this novel's Villainess a cardboard cutout, and then I woke up inside her. The comments came too, floating a foot from my face, counting down to the chapter where the family destroys her. I arrived mid-sentence, standing at a table of 19 people with a wine glass in my hand and my arm already going back, because the scene I had landed in was the family reunion dinner in Chapter 31, where Delphine Rourke slaps Sylvie Marchetti in front of everyone and gets thrown out of the house for the first time. I know it was Chapter 31 because I read it on a night shift 8 months ago on my phone, and I know what happens in Chapter 40, and the comments were counting down to Chapter 40 like it was New Year's. They hung in the air over the centerpiece in pale letters that nobody else could see. Slap her already. 9 chapters left cardboard. Sylvie deserves the world. I put my arm down. I set the glass on the table, and then I stood there in a dead girl's body in a dress I did not choose. In a dining room I had only ever read a paragraph about, doing the arithmetic that has kept me alive ever since, which is that I am 34 years old. My name is Iris Vail. I supervised an accredited paternity laboratory for 11 years, and I have just been dropped into the exact plot that a laboratory can end. Sylvie was still crying. She cries the way water runs, without effort and without any apparent decision, and she said, "Delphine, I'm not trying to take anything." And my mother, Vivian Rourke, who is not my mother, said, "Sit down, Delphine," in a voice that had a hand in it. What happens next in Chapter 31 is the shellfish. Sylvie eats a scallop that is not supposed to be on her plate, has a reaction at the table, and Delphine gets blamed for it, because Delphine is the one who spoke to the caterer that afternoon. So I said, "Beau, would you pass Sylvie the plate on your left instead?" And Beau Rourke, who is 26 and built like a door, said, "Why?" And I said, "Because the one in front of her has scallops under the crust, and she's anaphylactic." And I told Marguerite in the kitchen at 4 o'clock, which is why the tray came back with a note on it. "Go and look at the note." He did not go and look at the note. Grandmother Fee did. She is 91 years old. She has a hearing aid she turns off like a light switch, and she came back from the kitchen with a slip of paper in her hand and read it out. "No shellfish for the young lady, Delphine Rourke, 410. Fee looked around the table with the delight of a woman who has been bored since 1998 and said, "Well, that's disappointing for everybody." Above the salt cellar, the comments were losing their minds. Wait, what? Why is she being normal? This is not the scene. Guys, the plate thing is not in the book. Here is what I knew, and here is what it cost me to use it. The novel is called The Rourke Inheritance, and it has 400,000 readers, and I got 11 chapters into it on that night shift before I left the review, and then I finished it anyway at 2 in the morning, the way you finish a bag of chips you are not enjoying. The plot is the one you already know. A wealthy family discovers that the daughter they raised is not theirs, that a swap occurred at a private clinic in 2006, and that the real daughter has been living in a rented room 3 towns over with nothing but a grandmother's ring and an orphanage record. The real daughter is Sylvie, and she is gentle and everybody loves her. And the fake daughter is Delphine, who is proud and cold and cruel, and who spends 40 chapters trying to hold on to a life that was never hers. In Chapter 40, there is a public confirmation test at Sylvie's wedding, and Delphine screams that it is a lie, and the family has her committed to a private facility, and the epilogue mentions her twice, once to say she is stable, and wants to say she was not invited. 400,000 people found this satisfying. I ran a paternity laboratory for 11 years at a hospital and then at a private accredited lab, and I want to tell you what I actually thought while reading it, which was not moral outrage, it was professional insult, because the entire plot rests on one test done at one clinic by one physician who has been the family's doctor for 30 years, and no one in 400,000 people ever asked the only question that matters, which is who handled the samples. So I made my decision at that dinner table before the plates were cleared, and it was not to survive Chapter 40. It was to make Chapter 40 happen early, in a room I chose, with a courier I hired. The comments I learned over the next few days are not a superpower. They lag by about a scene. They spoil things that have not happened yet, but only things that are still going to happen. And the moment I changed something, the comments about that thing went strange and thin, like a radio between stations. They cannot hear me think. They cannot see anything Delphine's eyes are not pointed at, and they hate me, personally and with real energy, in a way that I found genuinely difficult for the first 2 weeks and then stopped finding difficult, which is its own kind of information about how these things work. I could not tell anyone. There was no version of that sentence that helped me. Delphine's file at Nyman's clinic already contains the phrase acute stress episode from when she was 16, and if I had opened my mouth about a novel and floating text, I would have handed them Chapter 40 in the second week with a bow on it. The other thing I learned in those 2 weeks is that Delphine Rourke was 19 years old. The book never says it in a way that lands. She had a room at the end of the East Hall with a bad radiator, and under the bed she had 11 sketchbooks, and they are not bad. They are pencil studies of horses and hands and the same window over and over in different weather, and about a third of the way through the 7th book the horses stop, and it becomes pages of the same 3 words in different lettering, which are, I am trying. She had a horse called Pepper that was sold in 2021 while she was at school, and nobody told her until she came home at Christmas and the box was empty. She had letters. That is the part I want you to understand before I tell you about the auction, because everyone in that house had a story about how Delphine was born difficult, and I went through a 19-year-old's actual belongings and found a kid who had been raised by a rota of staff in a wing with a bad radiator, and who drew the same window 300 times. She was not a cardboard cutout. She was a person the book could not be bothered with, and neither could her family, and I had left 1 star and gone to sleep. So when I say what I did afterward was revenge, I want to be precise about whose. I found her last entry in the 11th sketchbook on the 4th day, dated the night before I arrived, and it is not a drawing. It is 1 line in the corner in small letters, and it says, "If I stopped, nobody would look up for a week." I have that page. I have kept it flat in a folder since the day I found it, and the folder is the only thing I brought with me out of that house when I finally left it. The necklace went up as lot 19. The Rourke necklace is the ritual object of this family, a cabochon and diamond thing from 1911 that gets worn at weddings and lent to the county museum every second summer. And in Chapter 34, the family holds a charity auction at the Holloway Rooms, and Delphine is discovered to have consigned it under a false name. In the book she has no answer, because in the book she did it. In life she had not done it, and I had 11 days of warning. So I did the least dramatic thing available, which is that I phoned the auction house on a Tuesday and asked for the consignment file on lot 19 as an interested party, and was told, correctly, that I could not have it. And then I went in person on the Wednesday with a solicitor named Bridget Eileran, whom I retained with the $1,100 that was in Delphine's account from her allowance, and asked again. On the night, Beau stood up in a room of 200 donors and did his part, which is a speech about how a family has to be honest with itself, and then Vivienne said, quietly, into a microphone she did not need, "Delphine, did you consign the necklace?" And I said, "No." Lot 19 was consigned on the 9th of March by a seller who supplied a driver's license, an address, and a bank account for the proceeds, all of which are in the house's file, and Miss Eileran has a certified copy. Bridget stood up in the third row and held it above her head like a woman starting an auction of her own, and I said, "The address is a mail drop in Calder. The account is at Fenimore Trust. The license photograph is of a man called Perry Dunn, who drives for this family on Thursdays." Somebody said, "Perry?" And I said, "Perry has driven for you for 9 years. Perry was told by someone in this room that this was a discreet family matter and that his name would be on the paperwork to keep the family's name off it. And he believed that, because when a doctor tells you something is a family matter, you believe him. I did not say the doctor's name. Bridget had been extremely clear that I was not to say the doctor's name yet, and it took everything I had. Beau came across the aisle and put his hand around my upper arm, hard enough that I had a mark for 9 days, and Fee turned her hearing aid on, which she does with a little theatrical click, and said, "Beauregard, take your hand off your sister, or I shall have a stroke on purpose." He let go, and Sylvie, who is very good at this, said through tears, "Can we please just stop? I don't want any of it. I never wanted any of it." And I said the line I had been holding since the dinner. I said, "Sylvie, you say you don't want it in every room where somebody might give it to you." Above the podium, the comments were doing something new. They were arguing with each other. Okay, that was cold, but she is not wrong. Why does Sylvie always say that at parties? Guy's the driver. Wait, is this a rewrite? Vivienne came for me in April, and she did it the way only a mother can, which is with primary sources. It was in the morning room with 6 people present, and she had a shoebox, and she read my letters out loud to the table. Delphine's letters, from boarding school, ages 11 through 14, 4 years of them, and they are what you think they are. Please, can I come home at the half-term? I will not be any trouble. I have been good, ask Sister Adele. I have worked out that if I get the early train I would not need collecting. And Vivienne read them in a warm, sad, generous voice, and then she said, "You see, she was doing it even then. Look how she works. Every letter has a request in it, and every request is dressed as an apology. This is not a new thing. I have been managing this since she was 11, and the room made the sound rooms make when they have been given permission." Beau said, "That's rough to hear, Mum." Somebody's husband said, "Poor Vivienne," and the comments overhead went off like a stadium. Mother of the Year, honestly. She has put up with so much. This is why I love Vivienne. I sat in that chair and I understood 2 things at once, and I could not do anything with either of them. The first is that I had read that same scene on my phone in chapter 36, and I had thought it was a good scene. I had thought, Oh, that's clever, the manipulative kid. And I had scrolled on. The second is that a woman had just taken the letters of an 11-year-old asking to come home for a weekend and offered them to a room as evidence of a character flaw, and every single person in that room, and 400,000 people outside it, and me 8 months ago on a night shift agreed. That is when it stopped being a plot to me. I did not have a clapback that morning. I want to be honest about that, because I have given you a lot of good lines, and that morning I did not have one. I said, "May I have them back?" And Vivian said, "They're mine, darling. They were sent to me," which is technically true. And I went upstairs and sat on the floor of a 19-year-old's bedroom with the bad radiator, holding a sketchbook for about 2 hours. Fee came in without knocking, at 91, on a stick, which cannot have been easy, and sat on the end of the bed and said nothing for a long while. And then she said, she read those out at Christmas 2019 as well, different audience. I said I did not know that. Fee said, "No, you were at school." Then she said, "My son married a woman who keeps receipts on children. I have thought about it for 30 years, and I have never found the bottom of it." I asked her why she stayed. She said, "Because someone in a house like this has to be awake." Then she said, "What do you need?" And I said, "A courier who does not work for this family, an appointment at a laboratory that has never taken a Rourke sample, and $11,000. Fee said, "Is that all?" and wrote a check on the corner of the bed with a fountain pen and said, "I want a receipt. I'm making a point. Here is the part everyone gets wrong, and the book got wrong, and the comments got wrong for 40 chapters. A paternity result is not a document. It is a process, and the document is the last 3 inches of it." Doctor Halvard Nyman had been the Rourke family physician for 30 years, and every biological question this family ever asked had gone through his clinic, including the 2006 delivery, including Sylvie's confirmation in the autumn, and what he produced each time was a summary page with a probability of 99.99 on it, signed on letterhead. Nobody had ever asked him for anything else, because a summary page looks like the truth and raw data looks like homework. I wanted the raw data, not the summary. I wanted the electropherograms, the actual traces, 21 loci with peak heights, plus the batch record, plus the chain of custody sheet showing who sealed the tubes and who carried them and at what time. And I did not ask Nyman for any of it, because he would have had a fire. I went the other way. Bridget filed a request with the accrediting body for the laboratory's proficiency records, which are semi-public, and separately we booked me and Fee into a testing service in the city under Fee's name, with a courier called Ostergaard, who has a chain of custody app and no idea who the Rourkes are. And I gave a buccal swab as a 19-year-old girl with a false comb, and Fee gave one as her grandmother. And 11 days later, we had a grandparentage panel run on 24 markers by people who had never heard of any of us. Sylvie found out about the appointment. I still do not know how, although I have a theory, and the theory has a Thursday driver in it. 2 days before the result came back, my sample at the city lab was flagged as compromised, tube seal broken in transit, and I got a very apologetic email, and Bridget said one word that I will not repeat, and then said, "Good, now do it again and let them do it again." So we did it again, and the second time Ostergaard's app photographed the seal at 4 points, and the second time it went through. And on the 14th of May at 9:10 in the morning, I sat in Bridget's office and read a document that said Fee Rourke and Delphine Rourke share a biological relationship consistent with grandmother and granddaughter at a probability of 99.994, which meant Delphine was a Rourke, which meant there had been no swap, which meant that Sylvie Marchetti was not a swapped baby who had come home, because there was no baby to swap her with, and the entire beloved architecture of 400,000 readers' favorite story was one falsified page produced by one physician in 2006 for money before Sylvie was even old enough to be part of it. The comments had no idea. The comments were still counting down. 4 chapters, 3 chapters. The wedding is going to be insane. And then on the 2nd of June, Beau, who is the loud one and therefore the useful one, forwarded a message into the wrong thread, into the family thread, with all 14 of us in it. And the message was from Sylvie to Nyman on the 11th of April, and it said, "How long do we have to keep doing this?" Beau's follow-up message 30 seconds later said, "Ignore that." Fee's message 90 seconds later said, "No." Sylvie came up the aisle on my brother's arm on the 21st of June, because Vivian's brother had died in 2019, and Beau had been given the honor, and the plan for that day, which I knew from a phone screen 8 months and 1 lifetime ago, was that between the ceremony and the meal Nyman would stand up with an envelope and confirm what everyone already knew, and Delphine would come apart in front of 300 people. They kept that plan. That is the thing about a room full of people who have been told a story they enjoy. They will run the scene even when the leading actress has been quietly not doing her lines for 4 months. So Nyman stood up under a tent on the south lawn with an envelope, and he is a beautiful old man, white hair, half glasses, a voice like a fire in a grate, and he said that he had delivered both of these girls, and that he had carried a difficult knowledge for a long time, and that a family deserves the truth on a happy day. And I let him finish. Bridget was extremely firm about that too. "Let him finish," she said, "because a man who is finished cannot unfinish." Then I stood up and asked whether, before he opened the envelope, he would tell the tent who had sealed the tubes. He said that this was hardly the moment. I said it was exactly the moment, because he had chosen it, and then I did it in the order Bridget drilled into me on her kitchen table, with salt cellars for props. First, the chain of custody sheet from the 2006 file, which Bridget had obtained through the accrediting body, and which has one name on it in 3 places: collection, sealing, and transport, and the name is Halvard Nyman. I said, "In an accredited laboratory, those are 3 different people. And the reason they are 3 different people is you." Second, the proficiency records, which show his clinic reported a blind panel wrong in 2011 and was written up, and which show something better, which is that the clinic has not held accreditation for kinship testing since 2013 at all. It has been producing letterhead. Third, the grandparentage panel from a laboratory nobody in that tent had ever influenced. 24 markers, with Fee's name on it and mine. And Fee stood up while I read it, 91 years old, and did not sit down again for 11 minutes. Vivian said, "This is a forgery." And I said, "It's a raw data set. You can hand it to any laboratory in this country tonight, and they will read the same peaks. That is the entire difference between what I have and what he has." Nyman said, "There are proper venues for this." I said, "There are." Miss Eileran filed with the medical board on Tuesday and with the district attorney on Wednesday, and I would have told you, but you were rehearsing." Then Beau, God love him, said out loud in front of everyone, "Wait, so who was Sylvie's message about?" And the tent turned as one animal and looked at a woman in a wedding dress, and Sylvie did the only thing she had, which is that she sat down on the grass and cried, and it was real. And I want to be fair to her, because it took me until that afternoon to work out that she was 17 when Nyman found her and told her a story about a rich family and a ring, and that she has spent 4 years being a beloved character in a book she also never asked to be in. Anton Brandt, who had married her 40 minutes earlier, stood there with his hands open. Vivian said, "Delphine, whatever you think you're doing," and I said the line I did have, this time the one I had been carrying since April, in the same folder as a page that says if I stopped, nobody would look up for a week. I said, "I'm not doing anything. I'm just the first person in this family who asked to see the working." And over the tent, over 300 people and a cake, the comments went strange and thin, and then they went quiet one at a time. The consequences took 14 months, and they are mostly filing dates, which nobody tells you. Halvard Nyman's license was suspended in July and surrendered in October, and he took a plea in the spring on 2 counts of forgery and 1 of obtaining money by deception. And he is 78 and got 18 months, and the practice he built in 1979 was sold in pieces. The 2006 page was not his only one. Once the board opened the door, 4 other families came through it, including one in which a man had paid child support for 9 years on a summary page, and that case is still going. Beau was charged over the auction, pled to a public order offense, paid a fine, and lost the seat on the foundation board that his mother had bought him in 2022. Vivienne was not charged with anything because she had not done anything except believe, loudly and expensively, for 4 years, a thing that suited her. What happened to Vivienne is quieter. In September, Fee exercised a clause in the trust that had been sitting there since 1986 that nobody had read, and Bridget had read it, and by Christmas Vivienne had a house and an income and no signature on anything. She sends a card at Christmas. It says, "From Vivian," in her own hand and nothing else, and I keep them. Perry Dunn got his name off the auction file, an apology from the house, and a job with somebody better. And Sylvie Marchetti was not charged either, because Bridget and I asked the district attorney not to, and because she gave 3 days of testimony against Nyman that put him away, including the part where he came to her group home when she was 17 with a photograph of a ring. Thank you for listening to Channel Crystal Novel. Her marriage lasted 9 weeks. She came to the house in November, in the rain, in a coat that was not warm enough, and she stood in the hall and said, "I know what you're going to say." I said I did not think she did. She said, "Say it anyway, I deserve it." And that, right there, that little offered plate, is the thing she has done to every room she has ever walked into. And I had watched her do it for 8 months and read about her doing it for 40 chapters. So I did not take it. I said, "Sylvie, I'm not going to help you feel punished. That's the last thing in the house that still works for you, and I'm taking it away." She stood in the hall for a while. Then she said, "So what do I do?" And I said, "You get a job, and you come to dinner on Sundays if you want, and you never again tell a room you don't want something while you're standing in the middle of it." She said, "That's it?" I said. That's it. It's not forgiveness. It's Sundays. So I won, and then I had to live in it, which is the part the epilogue of that book would never have covered. I was 19 years old, with a controlling interest in a family I had studied, like a set text, and a hall full of portraits of people whose noses I now have. I could not go home. I have tested that in every way a person can, and I have made my peace with it in the way you make peace with weather. Iris Vail is presumably still on shift somewhere, or is not, and I have decided not to build a life out of that particular window. What I did instead was practical, because practical is the only thing I have ever been good at. I sat the exams. I am in my 3rd year now, biochemistry, at a state university 40 minutes from the house, where exactly one person knows anything about any of it, and I work Saturdays in a genetics lab, washing glassware and logging samples for a woman named Dr. Priyanka Sen, who thinks I have an unusual interest in chain of custody paperwork for a 2nd year. Fee is $93. She turns the hearing aid off during the news and on during arguments, and last month she introduced me to a visiting bishop as my granddaughter, the one who reads the working, and then turned it off before he could reply. Sylvie has come to 19 Sundays out of a possible 52, which is a better record than Beau. And the sketchbooks are on a shelf in the room with the good light now, not under a bed, and I finished the 11th one badly because I cannot draw a horse and never will. And on the last page opposite the line that says if I stopped, nobody would look up for a week, I wrote the date and I wrote, someone looked up. The comments never came back, not once in 3 years. And I have stopped waiting for them at parties. I think about them more than I should, though, because I know exactly who they were. I was one. I read 11 chapters about a proud, cold, difficult girl who kept trying to hold on to a family that had already given her away, and I decided she was a cardboard cutout, and I gave the book 1 star, and I went to sleep. It never once occurred to me to ask what she wanted, or who had raised her, or why a 19-year-old would draw the same window 300 times in different weather. That is the whole thing I brought back from being her. Anyone can be written badly. Most people are. The only real question, in a novel or a dining room or a tent on a lawn, is whether one person in the room is willing to ask to see the working. So here is what I want to know from you, since you have been reading over my shoulder this whole time, which is a position I know something about. Did she go far enough, or was she still too merciful? Comment justice if the ending was perfect. Comment harder if you wanted an even colder revenge. Your comments decide how ruthless the next ending should be. Like and subscribe if you want to be here for the next